Roger Myerson, it's good to see you again.
It's good to be here with you again also.
It was just over 9 months ago that you were in Stockholm to receive your Bank of Sweden Prize in Economics. And then we had the good fortune to interview you together with Eric Maskin. Leo Hurwitz, unfortunately, wasn't in town then. And in that interview, we concentrated almost exclusively on mechanism design theory and its applications. And just towards the end, we began to touch on the interaction between economic sciences and other disciplines. And it's really at that point I'd like to sort of launch off here. And let's begin with something interesting that you pointed out that happened in something else you did when you were in Stockholm in December, which was the Nobel Mines program. You and the laureates in the other disciplines sat around a table together with a BBC journalist, Sarah Montague, discussing various questions. And you pointed out that there was an interdisciplinary interchange that happened there at the table. And we're going to see an excerpt of that interchange later on in this interview. But could you describe in your own words what happened?
This to me was, this whole experience of winning a Nobel Prize is a wonderful fairy tale experience. But I must confess what excited me the most was to sit in this wonderful discussion. Sarah Montague is a wonderful moderator and ask good questions in this beautiful Royal Library, sitting around a lovely wooden panel table with great scientists from many disciplines, my colleague Eric and the physicists, chemists, life scientists, and medicine, biology, physiology. And Gerhard Ertl, this year's Nobel laureate in chemistry, was talking about the formation of carbon dioxide molecules, which he studied in micro detail and has been able to observe the process. But he started talking about it in terms that made it sound like economics to me. He talked about the carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide molecules being far from equilibrium and then getting to an equilibrium, and the importance of being near equilibrium and far from equilibrium. And this is the way we talk about economic systems. We do equilibrium analysis, or sometimes we do disequilibrium analysis. And then he started explaining that he understood carbon dioxide molecules in this physical catalyzed process that he was studying in technical terms that I didn't completely understand, but then he described it as being a self-organizing system. I had been bothered by a sense that something I'd written recently wasn't quite getting the point. It's something I'd actually been working on just before in October, and the work had to be set aside when I got a call about a Nobel Prize. But it was an applied paper trying to take some economic theory of agency, the moral hazard side of mechanism design, and apply it to thinking about the practical problems of how do you organize a political system that are really being addressed, I thought, by the US Army's counterinsurgency field manual. So Gerhard Ertl is talking about the organization of carbon dioxide molecules. He observes that the molecules in their separate formation are becoming a self-organizing system. And I realized that phrase, I'm not sure if I have his words exactly right, but that basic idea was something I hadn't mentioned in my paper. I was developing a theory of what is important in cultivating a new political system, which was what the United States was trying to do in Iraq after overthrowing Saddam Hussein. And I was aware that, in particular, Paul Bremer's book described his theory as being about you write a constitution and then you have a democratic state. And I thought, no, there's something wrong with that. And I was articulating a different theory, which was individual leaders build trust with supporters and with voters, and that builds up to a democratic state. But what was good about my theory and what was bad about the theory that I was finding in Bremer and in the field manual, I wasn't able to be articulate enough about it, and I had the sense that I wasn't doing a good job. And then listening to Ertl talk, I realized self-organizing system. You know, a complex system can be spontaneously self-organizing if it has many opportunities to start small and grow bigger. And that's true of leader-follower networks. They can start small and they can recruit new followers. But it's not true of a constitution. A constitution is something that you have to have. Either it's operative in pretty much the whole country, and everybody agrees it's the Constitution and these are the rules we follow, or it's nothing, it's just a piece of paper. And I got that insight because of something that he was saying about his understanding about how you get a gas of carbon dioxide, and it was so exciting to have ideas, to be able to learn and feel that an exchange of ideas, in this case he was just lobbing an idea to me and I was catching it and running with it. My recollection of the interview was I don't think I was very coherent in explaining my idea, but I was very excited to suddenly see things differently. I'm not sure I entirely answered Sarah Montague's original question, but it was very exciting to have a chemist say something and me to be able to see that it's like that in economics as well. That's science at its best. And to see things new, of course, is always when we're happiest in science.
Nicely put. Yeah, it comes across, because in the edited version of the Nobel Minds documentary that went out, your excitement is palpable. But that initial comment from Gerhard Ertl isn't there. So one isn't quite sure, perhaps, why you're so excited by the perfectly good question that's come from Sarah Montague. But yeah, that realization, that bubbling up is absolutely there.
Yes, there's something that isn't in even that version. I'm afraid I was referring to genetic material of which is sort of where does the state where do you build the structure from? And that was actually partly on my mind because of a question Sir Martin Evans had asked me the night before about something about where do we find the ideas of genetic material in economic theory. And I'm thinking, you're building the state, where is that? And I'm thinking, where's the basic information described and that was also something I was responding to, but I'm afraid no matter what you have, that question was the night before, not on camera. I was realizing what a follower expects from their leader defines standards of behavior, things the leader cannot do without raising into question whether the followers can continue, the supporters can continue to trust their leader. And for example, if you're a politician in a great established democracy and you're running for high office, you've had many years of working with people and you've been adhering to the written constitution of your country, and if suddenly in your mid-50s when running for high office you suddenly showed a casual willingness to violate the Constitution, people would worry about that, whether they could continue to trust you. I should say I've already missed something again, because let me say the most important thing I've missed, because my recollection, Sarah Montague was asking me, where is the economics? And the economics that I'd written another paper about the following technical problem, that in almost any organization, that's important, but in particular in political organization, there are reasons for followers to worry about whether they can trust their leader. In brief, because I ask you to do something and I promise to pay you in the future. Yes, I will reward you in the future. In government, in the highest level of government, powerful officials who are the leader of a government is being supported by ministers or local agents, people who are at the almost highest level of government have enormous opportunities for corruption, for profiting from the power, misusing the power of government. And the person at the top needs to make sure the whole team stays together and delivers what is good government. And for that, there has to be some promises that if you do the right thing for what the state needs, what the party and the state need, we'll take care of you in the long run. But that is a promise. And of course, later on, there'd be some, so an economic, I've written papers about the economic incentive that you never think about of leaders to break their promise to their followers and recruit new followers after they've been elected to high office. So you need to trust.
So the economics comes into the political question because of the incentives that are required, yeah.
And so now I study the question of the leader needs to trust that the followers will use the delegated power appropriately, and the followers, who become important agents of government, need to trust that political leaders will really remember to reward them. And in all of our countries, the leaders, the major party leaders, are people who first and foremost have a reputation for allocating patronage rewards reliably. Certainly in parliamentary countries, that's very clear. In presidential democracies, when the person is elected president, he is in danger of becoming statesmanlike and forgetting to do political favors for the backbenchers. But in the parliamentary system, they don't get confused, and parliamentary governments may be stronger because of that. I studied that problem of dynamic incentives economically, and I realized it's difficult. These relationships are fragile. A democratic politician needs, in addition to his reputation for patronage, also needs a reputation for delivering good services to the public. In an authoritarian country, the dictator only needs a reputation for taking good care of his followers. So it's good to have democracy, we like that. But the constant is that it's not so easy to be a political leader and have people support you in rising to power who can then be comfortable that after you get into power, you'll remember to pay them back and in one way or other make them glad that they supported you. That trust is a fragile thing. Because it's fragile, we can begin to hang other institutions of society on it, such as the written constitution. That's a very different way of thinking about the constitution. A constitution becomes self-enforcing when the senior... I've just turned things around. Paul Bremer, for example, was thinking about you write a constitution and then politicians come into it. And I've said, no, the Constitution works in our established democracies so very well because we have people with who are our leaders who have lifelong reputations for behaving according to it. Can I say, John Marshall, in his biography of George Washington, John Marshall, the first, well, not the first, but the great early Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, who perhaps did more than anyone else to define what the United States Constitution is, remarks, I don't remember the exact words, but remarks that the British colonial experience was uniquely conducive to America becoming a representative democracy. And what was that? Because for example, if you've just, for whatever reasons, occupied a country in the Middle East and you think it is appropriate to use this power to cultivate democracy there, you want to know what creates a democracy. Under the American Revolution, dare I say as American to a British subject, the American Revolution was a revolution of people who were in the provincial assemblies. They'd all stood to run for provincial assemblies. After the revolution, they couldn't say, this idea of elected representatives passing laws, we don't need to do that. Well, let's do a more efficient, let's do what I think is best right now and not bother with that. No, they came out of the revolution with existing personal reputations. The reason they were important people was that they had been elected as representatives, and you see that we Americans couldn't go back on it, so we were safe.
Yeah, I think you've used the phrase, you can't plant democracy in the tread of your boot. I think that's...
Yes, that's in the... Yes. But what you can do is give more carbon dioxide molecules opportunities to form. You could... If that occupation, that American occupation, Anglo-American occupation, I'm sorry, I'm not going to let your country off the hook. If our coalitional occupation of Iraq had not started with a written constitution and no elections, but instead had put off the national constitution for a while and had local elections at the village, at the city, at the provincial level, had delegated as much budgetary authority as possible to these locally elected leaders so that they could exercise patronage. A few of them might have actually spent the money well in hopes of rising to national leadership, and we've tried to do what we could as benevolent interveners to give them a chance to begin developing democratic reputations the way that democratic reputations are really developed as self-organizing systems. That's what we're trying to understand.
And that takes us back to the paper. If people go back and read that paper on Bremer and the counterinsurgency field manual, immediately one can see that you are talking about self-organizing systems. It's really apparent. Have you done anything since this Nobel Minds revelation to sort of put that back into the paper in some way?
No, I have a sense of what kinds of formal models might develop within my theoretical methodology, might develop that idea more fully. I have not, that's a hard job, and I haven't done it in the last 9 months. I've been busy, but it's also a hard problem. I have articulated it verbally within the model, within the discussion, and I think it's a persuasive argument. I don't think it's if I had a formal model, I'd be able to say more clearly, precisely what are the conditions, and it's a delicate question because it is certainly true. As I'm a game theorist first, that's my and a game theorist means that I'm interested in studying how the rules of the game, how a change in the rules of the game would affect behavior. And a political constitution of a nation is, in some sense, a description of the rules of the game that politicians play. And so I like talking about constitutions, and I like the idea that some group of people could get together and say, we changed the Constitution, now it's this, because that hypothetical is where I could be a good consultant. They could hire me perhaps to come in and say, they're trying to decide whether to write the Constitution this way or that way, and perhaps as a game theorist, my analytical methods might enable me to give them some useful advice. So I have a vested interest in the idea that people can write constitutions and have them apply. Let me be clear about that.
Okay, and it's a good experiment to be running as well.
But I think it's wrong to assume that a person who comes in on the back of an occupied army can make it happen. I think it's a much more delicate social phenomenon. The truth is, I think, for example, the American Constitution was a bunch of very prestigious leaders chose to get together and put their reputations on the line for this new Constitution. It then went through a kind of ratification process. But in some sense, their reputations again came first. So I'm moving towards a different kind of social theory that I'm only able to articulate. I'm not able to do much better than what I can do with you verbally. I don't have a mathematical model, but that perhaps we need to understand that our institutions grow out of individual reputations, that reputations then, that the rules of institutions then for new people whose lives are lived within those rules become part of people's reputations, and it forms on itself in that kind of, I think a good example in the American Constitution, the American political system, George Washington served 2 terms as president and then chose not to run for a 3rd term. That set up, other people then, aspiring politicians, wanted to be viewed as like George Washington, and so they chose also not to run for 3rd terms. And we had, for I think 140 years, based on one person's reputation being then applied to others, a de facto constitutional rule, which Franklin Roosevelt then chose, since it was not part of the written Constitution, to violate in the extremes of Depression and World War II. And then we thought we'd better write this into the Constitution. But I like thinking about what is a written institutional rule and what is a personal reputation in a more flexible way. My original economics was coming from a deeper understanding of people's difficulty trusting each other in political organizations, backbenchers having difficulty trusting the party leaders to really do, and therefore a party becomes stronger when it institutionalizes some solution to that. And then I began to realize maybe that is a better way to think about how you grow democracy in the first place.
Well, picking up on some other strands from this Nobel Prize discussion, the question of an economic scientist moving into the political sphere, you've explained why this sort of social policy is fair game for you in terms of subject matter, but is there not an antagonism on the part of those whose normal province it is that you are moving into this area?
There certainly can. I have had good, friendly discussions in which I've been accused of being an economic imperialist by political scientists. Of course, nobody has nobody has property rights to a good question in science. We should all pursue it. And so I took those discussions seriously in the following sense, and they were meant in the following sense. Don't come in and do political science assuming that nobody in political science has done anything interesting. You read the literature first. Well, nobody can read all the literature in any field, but I have taken very seriously those suggestions, and I've told my students the same. If you're trained as an economist and you'd like to think about questions which were in the traditional domain of political science, learn what the traditional political scientists have done with those questions, and that's very profitable. I've done that as much as I've been able to, and that's a good thing to do. And they're right to worry about people not doing their homework in that sense. On the other hand, the division between economics and political science evolved over time in the ancient Greeks. Certainly, the name economics goes back to Xenophon, a student of Socrates, and it's clear Socrates had an interest. Socrates and his students, Plato and Xenophon, had an interest in understanding the institutions of civilization, not separating the market for goods or from the competition for leadership. There are connections. We understand that I think people believe, probably correct, with good reason, that much of the poverty of the poorest countries in the world may be due to something perverse or dysfunctional in their political system or their legal system. So these are connected substantively, but they're also connected in terms of the way we understand them, because they're about people competing to sell shoes and toothpaste, or people competing for power. It's about there are differences, but they are both about competition among organizations, political parties, among firms. I said the ancient Greeks, the agora in the ancient Greek polis, was the city-state, was a place both of commerce and of deciding who was the leader, and of judging, making policy decisions for the state. That unity is appropriate if we can use it. And I would argue, I want to say as a game theorist, especially at a time when many people who've done work in game theory have been honored by the Nobel Prize Committee, that's appropriate because the scope of economics has been broadened by being able to add game theory methodology to price theory methodology. Augustin Cournot wrote one of the great early texts on economic theory in 1838, and he specifically says, he goes back to the ancient Greeks, that by the etymology of the word political economy, political means having to do with the polis, and economy literally means in Greek eco, the homestead and management of the estate or the homestead, so it's home management. It's home management of the city-state. So you're managing all the institutions of civilization. Cournot said, political economy by its etymology refers to the institutions of civilization, but it's come to mean in 1838 more the allocations of resources, and it still meant that in 1900 and in 1940. Getting in 1970, in 2008, when we're having this interview, I think people would more commonly say economics is about analysis of incentives. That's about people doing what they're motivated to do, and about institutions and organizations changing the motivations of people by changing the rules of the game or changing the way people are paid in order to get their behavior to change the rules of monopoly, of antitrust monopoly regulation, or tariff policies and trade rules, banking regulation. All of these are changing incentives, but they're about allocation of resources, but also about incentives. And the definition of economics has changed with a game theory framework. And yes, we can do political science too. Political scientists, from their traditional methodologies, know a lot about their field, and that's important. And the analytical methodology that's traditional in economics, as extended by game theory, I think is something that the political scientists should all be learning also as a part of their tools.
So broadening the discussion away from the interaction between political scientists and economic scientists, what you saw in Nobel Minds was the interaction of people in very different disciplines, and it was obviously very valuable. How does one foster that kind of interaction?
I think in any university, a meeting of the privilege of being a Nobel laureate and coming to Sweden with scientists is an opportunity to talk to scientists in other fields at the highest level, and it is a wonderful opportunity. In any university, however, there are also communities where people from different disciplines can get together and who share as academics a love of research, of science. I have to say, I think in the I was not surprised that in our conversations in Stockholm, that was sitting laureates talking about each other's field and asking each other questions, we discovered, again, as we have in our universities and these conversations many times before, that the life of research, what you have to do to think, to help yourself and your colleagues to think more creatively, to work on good questions, there are some things that are just the same across all fields. And it was wonderful to share that, to see and to see that each of us was characterized by loving the questions of our field first and foremost. Is it useful to interact? I think I would not claim. I was so excited to be able to get an idea a little better from listening to a chemist's talk. I wouldn't expect that to happen very often. It is often very useful to create interdisciplinary interactions. I'm thinking of something where we were studying dispute resolution, where I was part of an interdisciplinary team, an interdisciplinary research center that involved behavioral psychologists, social psychologists, lawyers, and economists of various stripes, including game theorists like me. And it was very useful. At some point in that, and this is, we realized it was easy to say either interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary, and I'm trying to decide which, because do those words mean exactly the same thing? And I think I may have gotten it wrong, because I want to say one of them. No, I don't think which. We want to make a difference between we're going to get together in a pool and none of us have our disciplines, but kind of play in a common pool, versus we're going to work together, you with your discipline, and me with mine.
I suppose we're talking multidisciplinary.
Yeah. And I think perhaps that's more multidisciplinary. That should have been the word because I remember it's been a while since I've been in that group, and I remember we decided we should use the right word. And I did say interdisciplinary before. We said, no, you're not between disciplines. We are in a room where there are many people, each with their own discipline, so this is a multidisciplinary interaction, which actually is rather good when you think about it, because discipline is like a stern thing, and if you have multiple disciplines, well, that's very stern. We should stick to what we know how to do, and not. But those multidisciplinary interactions can be very useful, can be very fruitful, They are hard to legislate by deans, or it's hard. But when people see the opportunities, it's important that we should jump at them. It's important, I think, academic administrators, this is part of what I understand is in the lore of how to build a great university. And I think it comes from being ready to support good proposals where the professors in different disciplines have expressed a real interest in building with each other. And I think in each academic discipline we need to remember it might be very fruitful to talk. As I say, I would not work in political science without wanting to have a multidisciplinary dialogue with political scientists of other disciplines, other methodological disciplinary backgrounds that are quite different from what we train ourselves to do in economics.
And the problem is perhaps that it's difficult to plan the sort of benefits you're going to get, so that even if heads of different departments put together a proposal for the departments to interact, is going to be over something, whereas what happened between you and Ertl was that he was talking about surface catalysis.
Exactly.
And why should that relate to Iraq? Well, it did.
It was just, obviously, my mind was prepared in a certain way. And by the way, to talk about creativity, I had written something that I thought was important to write, but I was conscious of that it wasn't good enough, that there was something missing, and that's important. It's important not to write something down and say, I really like that, that's good. It's important not to be too critical. One has to be able to let go. But I was a prepared mind partly because since mid-October, I think my theory of decentralized leadership is the right way to build a state, and the centralized theory that I saw in this other book, that's not right. But I couldn't come up with why do I have this prejudice? And I'd said to people, I have this prejudice, I'm not being articulate enough. And then Ertl talks about self-organizing systems, and I said, oh yes, of course. So I was waiting for that. I was discontent.
So creativity, by that definition, is prepared mind. It's openness. It's searching.
You have to let yourself understand that what you don't know, and when you've learned something, to recognize that it's not good enough and keep trying to improve it. Absolutely, it's a certain obsessiveness that is necessary.
You mentioned that you haven't been able to really get the model made, and is that partly the effect of having been awarded the prize 9 months ago and the way that takes over life?
Yes, that helps give me an excuse, but that's not all. Coming up with models, even when you have a good intuition of what the model should be, is hard work. It's the right model, in some sense, is an evolutionary model, and I have not written any papers about evolutionary modeling. I have one paper, but there's a huge literature of evolutionary models that I haven't paid enough attention to. The right thing for me to do, and this is how you do this stuff, is try to find, an analytical model is a simplified version of the universe that which a point you're trying to make can be seen more clearly, and everything else has been simplified away. It's like the world in the way that in enough ways to be able to explain, to be able to show how things happen in your theory, but it's everything else is simplified away. It turns out, so the right model should be a very simple little point, but it turns out there are many simple models, most of which turn out to be either intractable or they somehow miss the point. So one needs to learn the technology of what kinds of models work well and what kinds of results can you get out of them. And for that, it really helps to know what other people have done. I've been talking with students about the creative process, the scientific process, how to be a good scientist. And the truth is there are simple ways of laying things out that we haven't thought of before that will enable us to understand real social problems much better. I know that. And they will be obvious, easy ways to think about things when we see them, because by the way, the ideas of mechanism design, for which I've just been awarded this prize this year, it's really, in some sense, it's that some technical mathematical sophistication, but not very much. It's not, and people just didn't look at it that way. The idea of the basic framework of game theory is simple, but so we just need to find those easy ways of thinking about things. But there are so many easy ways of thinking about it, and it's very rare that anyone just comes with that beautiful idea that 100 years from now we'll understand better. We won't get there in one step. We'll have to move step by step, just changing other models a little bit, because it's very, very hard to find the right mathematical assumptions so that everything goes through very cleanly. And for that, I need to study the literature that already exists on evolutionary models. I need to do a lot of background homework, see what kinds of results you can get with what kinds of models in other questions, and then show that's what it's going to take. And that's several years of work if I can do it. I'd like to do it.
It's interesting. Often the wording used to describe the model once it's built is deceptively simple, and it sounds as,
oh yes, a good model, if you're not technically sophisticated, you may have difficulty with what some people would call my simple models, but a good model, a well-trained economist should be able to hear and say, oh yes, of course, and yet I'm going to teach him something. And by the way, a good researcher should be prepared to remember when something has become obvious, that it wasn't obvious a few minutes ago and that you have learned something. But this ridiculously simple model has suddenly made something clear that wasn't clear when I hadn't thought about the world in this way. These models are stories. They're stories about, imagine an island that has these kinds of people living on it who have these goals and this kind of stuff growing that they can cultivate in various ways, and this is but then this island, it's a very simple story, like a novel, like a play or a movie, but it's just complicated enough that they come to some social problems, and then we can show that if we could reform an institution or change some of the rules that they set for themselves, that they would be better off. A good applied theory model should look ridiculously simple, but I can tell you from personal experience, first of all, I think I'm good at it because I'm tenured at a professor at a great university. I've also won a Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences, so I think I'm good at this. But I've written papers that had ridiculously simple models that took me 6 months to almost a year of struggle to find. And I said, oh, why didn't I think of this, last January? But I tried a lot of things that just got very complicated, or sometimes, of course, what happens is you discover your intuition wasn't right. You can't make a model like that because it doesn't work that way. Something else is needed, and that is part of what you're learning from this process.
Yeah, so the mathematics, in a sense, is a test of...
Absolutely, of the logic, and we regularly learn from the test. I've had students ask me, do you start with a model that you think is a good description of reality and then learn from it? Or do you think this is the way, this cause has this effect in society and I'm going to build a model to show how it happens, show that it's true? And the answer is, in some scientific sense, one ought to first build the model and then learn what real, but you don't do that. You start with an intuition that people are making mistakes in, say, at the highest level of government or firms, or there's banks are being badly managed or whatever, because there's something people are missing that you already understand. And then you build an analytical model to explain, so that other people can see what you think you already understand. And then you discovered that you didn't really understand it. I have had many conversations with people where I have said, I think this is the wrong policy in this this is what they should do, and here's the argument why. And then I pause and I say, but I don't really have a model of this, so we shouldn't be too sure. And sometimes I discover when I try to do this, less often now, but still a good 30% of the time, that the model can't be built to articulate my original intuition, because my original intuition was wrong. I was just spinning words together with somewhat of a trained insight, but not good enough. It's better when you've gotten the whole thing worked out.
Yeah. I just want to turn quickly to your own development as a model maker. You were a mathematician, and you moved in to the area of economics, quite sort of quite suddenly, if you like.
Not at all. And no, I was interested in mathematical social sciences since I was a kid, and I even discussed this in the interview, the Asimov science fiction story about the mathematical social scientist saved the universe. I read as a young teenager, and so I always had in mind that I was interested in, if it was possible to make a career doing mathematics and economics, that I wanted to try to do that. Yes.
Then may I rephrase the question? Your own development as a model maker occurred at what point? Because you needed to get enough maths in order to become a model maker.
Yes.
How do you judge at what point you're ready?
Yes. Yeah, it's a good question, because I started with an intuition when I arrived in college that I wanted to study as mathematical social sciences, and economics was exciting because it was the most mathematical of the social sciences, and decades later I tried to invade other social sciences. Yes, that was not surprising, because I wanted to be a mathematical social scientist, not just an economist. But what were the fruitful models? And as a student taking a course in decision analysis from Howard Rafa was just that's when things crystallized. There were many mathematical models that seemed fruitful, but he looked at the individual decision making, a model where we assume an individual has a utility function, which is a preference structure that is well defined mathematically by this utility function, how much utility he or she is going to get from each possible consequence, and has beliefs that are described by probabilities, and then makes choices and maybe learns something and makes new choices and builds a strategy. This course, it was about decision making. Suddenly I was focused, and notice much of the much of the economics that I was seeing before was about supply and demand curves. This course focused us on individual decision making, and then at the end he said, well, when you have 2 decision makers or 3 decision makers, that would be game theory, but that isn't very well developed. And I said, oh, we can't go on like that. We have to understand game theory, and if that's not well developed, I want to be part of developing it, and that was it. I worked in my early career from that day, and the end of my undergraduate time through graduate school and a young professor, mostly on methodology of game theory, because just the idea that, but notice that's not applied modeling. I really came to applied modeling much later in my life. I did some papers that had an applied focus where I was working on a new general method of analyzing a huge class of social problems. I had a colleague who was working on regulation, and when we wrote a paper on regulating monopolists that took the new tools I was working on, and his interest in the problems of regulating monopolies. So it was an applied paper and a methodological paper, both one author coming from one motivation, one from the other. It was only when I decided to start working more on political science, I think that I began to say, there are things we don't understand about electoral systems, about building and developing new political systems, where I had a specific substantive interest in the world, and we need ways to organize our thinking better. And so I think it's a rather later, I was happy to share this with young students who may be doing this right away in their career, but it's very hard to come up with a ridiculously simple model of a good ridiculously simple model of an applied problem. I think our model, my early career model with David Barron on regulating a monopolist, the simplification was to focus on the simple fact that the regulator doesn't know what the monopolist's cost structure is, and that there's a problem of learning that, and that the monopolist knows more, and that difference of information was central. everybody may have known, who worked in regulation may have been aware of that, but the idea, let's strip everything away from regulatory problems except for that and just focus on that and ask, what do you do about that? About getting information from the monopolist about their cost structure, about how low you can regulate the price. That was a good applied insight of what ridiculously simple model should we be thinking about. And it was an important paper. But I didn't start worrying about the regulating monopolists. He was wandering down the halls with some tools, and my colleague said, come on over, let's work on this.
Okay, well, I think on the complexity of the ridiculously simple, let's end. So
thank you so much. It's
thank you
wonderful
very
talking
much
to you.
indeed.